Fantastic. Well, welcome and thank you all so much for coming out today. This change management topic is one of my favorites because as human beings, we do just tend to assume like implementing change is just about roll something out and tell people what you want them to do differently. And there's actually a ton of science behind change that we're going to spend some time today helping unpack so that you both in your role particularly, but also taking things back for your leaders can really understand that like how do you approach the science of change and how do you make key differences in terms of what folks are trying to accomplish. I am going to walk us through quite a bit of information today as part of that. Hold on just a second, unless I can't get my screen to share. I'm going to walk us through some of that. Some of you, I think I've met most of the folks on today's call in one way, shape, or form. But to give a little bit of background, I'm the owner of People Solutions Center and have been building this business for the last 8 years. But my experience prior to owning my own business is really where my expertise comes from a change management perspective. My previous world, I worked for Progressive Insurance. I was their director of claims and contact center recruiting for 12 years. The first 2 of those, I actually was in more of a process leader role. So we were implementing major strategies. I took the organization through the implementation of their very first applicant tracking system, meaning for the first time you could apply online for a position at Progressive Insurance. That was in 2002. I literally watched the website come live for the first time for people to be able to do that, which seems like not a big change until you realize that there were 70 recruiters behind the scenes who had always worked with paper resumes and all of their processes were based on paper. And so over the course of that 12 years in sort of this process and strategic leader role, I really had the opportunity to learn a ton about how do you take large organizations, and large meaning 70 or so people, through a major change and get folks to really be on board along the way. And so I've been able to take a lot of that experience from a leadership perspective and share it and condense it down into here's some of the key things from change management practice in my own experience, building my knowledge in change management and bring it to folks. And to be honest, this is one of my favorite pictures when I think about change management, because every time we talk to organizations and clients about implementing something that even just feels like the smallest change, sometimes can feel like a huge elephant kind of going up the hill that you're pushing from behind. And it can be really exhausting and really easy for like everybody to just roll back down the hill. And so the concepts that we're going to bring forward for you today give you some of that understanding of the science behind change management and also some of these. So here are actual approaches to implementing change that you can take back and use with your teams along the way. This first piece is one of probably the most game-changing pieces I've ever seen in change management. And while it is a cartoon with stick figures, the number of times that I pull this up and people go, oh, like now I get what I've been living, right? Because as human beings, it doesn't actually matter whether or not a change that you're trying to take me through is positive or negative. This is the cycle that my brain has to go through in order to make that change happen. And even when change is positive, we still have this shock and denial phase that often gets overlooked. And what's particularly important when you are the person leading the change is you've had all of this time. First of all, it was probably your idea in the first place, or at minimum, right? You got on board with the idea way before everybody else that you're trying to implement it with. So you're already on the way up the hill to integration, but everybody you're introducing it to for the first time is back here in shock and denial. And we forget that this is a very natural reaction for people, even when it's something that is positive, and they have to go through this emotional turmoil. Sometimes you will hear in change management this called the valley of despair. That just sounds so awfully cold to me. So I go with emotional turmoil, but people are going through a grief cycle for whatever was before. and however they felt about it. And it doesn't mean they won't eventually get through that. But if we let this shock, denial, grief cycle derail our change, we never get to the point where people start to actually implement it and move up the hill. And oftentimes as leaders, to be quite honest, we feel people's fear and despair, and we feel their sense that this isn't going to work, it isn't going to work. And we freeze, or worse yet, we go, oh, never mind, everybody hates it. And we don't even try to get up the hill. And so change management is all about, first of all, understanding that this is not only a natural course of things, it's a necessary course that every person on your team has to get through in order for real integration to come along. And in fact, if you implement a change and none of this happens, you might need to ask yourself whether or not you actually got to full integration, or did people just go, wait it, don't get upset, just wait it out and see if they really meant for us to do it. Because sometimes organizations, if they don't have a habit of working through that emotional turmoil, their team members will truly tell them, you know what, don't worry about this. If you don't like the change, just wait. They won't stick with it. And that's where organizations get into these cultures where they really never see major changes come to fruition. People just assume it's a shiny object that's going to go away tomorrow. But we have to recognize that as a leader, you've had time to go through shock, denial, emotional turmoil. You're halfway up the hill and maybe all the way up the hill on the change that you want to make. But other people are hearing this for the first time. And so how do you, first of all, start your change management process before you need the change to take place? Start planting the seeds so this shock and denial part, this emotional turmoil, can happen well in advance of when you need people to actually start doing something different so that you have your momentum going in the right direction. And so what we're going to talk about today is, how do you do this? How do you actually take this change management cycle and start with assessing your organization for change, then preparing it for change, and then actually building the plan. And what we see in organizations is, all too often, or teams come in and they go straight to maybe plan for change, maybe. But most often they simply go into like, we're implementing the change. And they've skipped this assess and prepare stage. Sometimes they've also skipped the plan part of it as well. And it's those first two pieces that are so critical to getting a change management plan correct. And yes, change management plan has to start at the exact same time that the actual work starts to figure out what the change will be. If we wait until we've built the change, we've put in the new process, we've defined it, we've done all these things, and then 2 weeks before we start going, okay, now how are we going to communicate this? We've missed the opportunity to actually get people through the change management cycle as we go. And the bigger the project, the bigger the change, the more time you need to spend in assessing and preparing the organization for that change. In addition to this, we really skip this if we believe that our change that we are preparing for is positive. If we are implementing a bonus program that only has great things, right? Or we're planning on, FLSA is one that I often will tell folks, right? In theory, if you change to get compliant with Fair Labor Standards Act, people are getting paid overtime they weren't getting before. It's almost always to their benefit. And yet it is the one change that everybody freaks out over, because we make assumptions that positive change doesn't have this same sort of cycle of emotional turmoil. And so what I'm going to walk you through today is, what do we mean by assessing an organization for change, preparing, and what are the things you need to do to prepare for change? And then how do you actually build your plan and implement change as we go? But let's start with the assessment phase. I will tell you, this is one that very few organizations do well. And even if they have a general assessment, they don't always do the assessment as it relates to this particular change. And this will vary based on the kind of change you may be trying to implement. But I want you to think about your current organization and how would you rate the organization's ability to adapt to change. This varies based on the company culture. Some organizations are very much at the like, we love change, and sometimes we just like to shake it up because we've been doing the same thing for too long, right? And some of this is like, it's an ingrained culture to always be asking, should we be doing something different? What should that look like? How do we get there? I would say my team, because my personality tends to be on the one end of change, I tend to promote this culture. And so my team is closer to the one end of the scale. They're not surprised when Katie says, well, maybe we should just do it differently. Like nobody's shocked at it. And they tend to be leaning in themselves with, hey, Katie, maybe we should change this. On the flip side of things, at the 10 end of the scale, these are organizations that start from a place of, we prefer not to change. And if you're going to change something, I better be really convinced that that the idea is going to work. And so organizations at this end will take a lot longer to assess, is this the right thing? Should we do it? They're going to analyze it quite a bit. And if somebody is really opposed, they might not actually pull the trigger on change at all. But change is going to be much slower in that kind of an organization. And then we have something in the middle, and the in the middle tends to be like, first of all, sometimes like you've got some people that are trying to change everything. You've got some people that are like, I'm stuck in my ways and I'm not going anywhere. But it's hard to read how every single change may go. So as you think about your organization on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you put your own organization today? And there can be every number in between, right? My team would probably put themselves somewhere towards the 2 or 3 end, I would think, on most things, just based on when I roll things out, the kinds of reactions that I get from folks. But assessing change starts with understanding your organization. I have a client today that is firmly at the 10 end of the scale. And even the most minor change that has major benefit for team members is met with stark resistance. And so much so that even if you say the word, like consider a concept that might be different, you can feel people tense. They're not like vocal about it, so you don't get people like yelling at you the way we imagine when they're going through shock and denial. But you have to plant a lot of seeds before you actually get people to change. When we roll things out, we have to spend a lot of time helping people understand the why before we even start to discuss the what. There's a book out there that's one of my favorites, and I referenced some books at the end of this, called My Iceberg is Melting, or Our Iceberg is Melting. And it's by a gentleman by the name of John P. Cotter. And he is one of the premier authors in the leadership space, particularly around change management. And Cotter talks about this concept that he lays out in this book, and it's also a fairly common book in change management in general, is this idea of ADKAR. And ADKAR is an acronym that starts with this idea of awareness. And this idea that in order to truly, like when you are assessing an organization for change, you have to figure out what stage of the change management process is your team today. Sometimes we're making a change on something people don't even know is a problem. And those are hard changes to make because they don't start with a burning platform that people already recognize. It's easier to implement change if everybody on the team has a process that they know is clunky and it's causing people problems and everybody's super annoyed by it. It's easy to rally people to say, great, well, here's how we're going to fix that for you, which is change, but they already knew there was a problem, so they don't feel that sort of emotional turmoil at the same level. If, on the other hand, I need to make a change that people aren't feeling any pain around, so Fair Labor Standards Act is a good example, right? Or maybe it's a process behind the scenes where your accounting software or your payroll software works really well for the people on the front line, but the people in the back trying to run payroll are working with a really outdated, antiquated system that doesn't work well. Well, changing it for the people who think it's fine is a really big problem, right? They're not going to understand the why. And so in those situations, we have to spend a lot of time on awareness before we actually even start talking about what the new thing will be. They need to know there's a reason to move in the first place. And in Cotter's book on Our Iceberg is Melting, he tells the story of, he uses a fable about penguins, right? And in this scenario, the penguins are in a situation where their iceberg is melting, and there are a few folks that are recognizing it, but most of the penguins are unaware that there's a problem. Well, why would I pick up and move my home if I don't understand that there's a problem in the first place? And so he starts this ADKAR model, which is first, how do you build the campaign for there is a problem in the first place? Once we have awareness that there's a problem, we can start to move into desire. And this is really where we start to address that emotional turmoil that came out of that change management cycle. This is where we start to get the opportunity to talk about what are the benefits for adopting the new change? How can life be better if we move forward into a new space? But again, planting the seeds early before it's time for somebody to implement the change can be huge. Even the smallest change, right? Like the smallest change in your process can cause people just fear and consternation. They don't want to get it wrong. It disrupts the flow they've already had. So we have to make sure that there's enough momentum for, why should I bother? What's going to be better for me, not just what's going to be better for the organization. Then we have to assess the change for, and so part of your assessment is, how much desire will there be? Sometimes we don't have a choice, right? There's a change you've got to put in place, and it doesn't matter if everybody does, if nobody wants to do it or not. Other times you come to an assessment that the change actually might be better for people, but they're never going to know it because it's something that happens behind the scenes, and you have to weigh out, is now the right time for that particular change to be implemented? The third piece we need to assess is, what's the knowledge? And this is really important when you're talking about talent, right? Because what if folks are missing technical skills in order to implement the change that you want? Particularly when we talk about software, this becomes a really big piece. If I need a team of people who don't have a lot of understanding of technology and things like that, and I'm going to need them to adapt a new software, I better assess how much of that skill they're going to need to learn before I just get into the, well, just flip the switch and let's make it happen. In the example I gave about the applicant tracking system at Progressive, right, there was an awareness because recruiters had piles and piles of resumes everywhere, and keeping them organized, I still am amazed that anybody ever did that job well. There was a desire from some, but not all. A lot of people liked their paper and their pens. What probably was our biggest challenge was they not only didn't know how to use an applicant tracking system, those were three words that nobody in the HR world even knew what they meant at the time that we went live with our system. We were on the forefront. That's really frightening for 2002, but we were on the forefront of this kind of technology. So when I would talk about the benefits and how excited we were for where we're going, they were like, they didn't even have anything to think about or relate it to, more or less have the technical skills and the technology know how to do this. And so we had to spend a lot of time in this knowledge space before we could even start to say, now we're ready to pull the trigger. And so there were a lot of steps in our change management around introducing people to concepts, showing them and demoing, not so that they could do it themselves, but so that they could even envision the processes that would be impacted, so that they could tell us what we needed to address before we went live. The fourth piece of the ADKAR model is the ability piece. And this is assessing, how ready is your organization? It's one thing to have to teach people knowledge, but it's another thing if you recognize, do we have the right structure in place? And do we have the right talent in place in order to be able to get where we need to get? Organizations sometimes miss this, and it ends up making for a very frustrating change management process, because I'm trying to force somebody to implement something and to change something that they actually don't have the competencies to be able to do. I've elevated the level of their job, and they may not have the skills to be ready for those kinds of things. And so in this ability phase, you really need to step back and think about where is my talent pool today? Who will be able to get there if I give them the right training? Who maybe doesn't have that right skill set? And how are we going to address that if that happens? Now, sometimes we're not always right on this ability thing. One of my favorite stories from Progressive, we had a team member that was a recruiter of ours, and we were implementing a huge change. We basically were restructuring the entire organization and redefining what it meant to be a great recruiter. And our recruiters historically had been order takers. Hiring manager says, here's who I want to hire. I only want candidates who have this. This is what we're doing. Run an ad. Like, they just sort of told the recruiter what to do. The recruiter did it. Didn't matter if they were like, man, this is not right. We're not going to find that candidate. This pool doesn't exist. Here's what they really should do. They were not allowed the flexibility to be a subject matter expert. So we shifted our entire model in the recruiting department to go from being order takers and customer service, and instead, how do you become a trusted advisor and a subject matter expert to your hiring manager so that you are partner in this? And as we rolled this out, there were so many implications to their jobs, right? There were so many things. So in preparation for it, my leadership team and I sat down and we went through our entire team of folks and said, who do we feel like really has the competencies and skills to get this? And like, they will be at the forefront. Who do we think will really struggle with the concept? Not because they don't have the skills, but because they have no desire to do that, right? They love being order takers and they don't want to be a subject matter expert. And on the flip side, who's going to have the desire, but they're going to be a little short on that competency piece? And what can we do to help them get there? And then what kinds of things are we going to consider if ultimately they can't evolve to the new space? And so as we did this, it was really interesting to watch it play out over months and months. It took us probably a full year to get the new structure fully implemented. And there was one individual on the team, and her name was Kathy. And when we went through that initial analysis, we had Kathy, we were unsure about desire for Kathy because we're like, there's a chance we roll this out. And she is like, no, I want nothing to do with this. But if Kathy gets a little desire, she might be on fire in terms of what she wants to do, but we really did not believe she might have the competencies to do it. But we were really, really confident she could be stubborn sometimes. And we're like, she might get stuck in emotional and turmoil and not move past it. So we started to roll things out. And lo and behold, Kathy, like, I remember the day that I was meeting, we had the whole team offsite for like 3 days. And the first day I'm explaining the concepts and where we're headed and why we're going there. And about 2 hours into this big group conversation, Kathy's hand goes up. And I thought, oh, like my pit of my stomach starts to drop because I sure Kathy was going to tell me all the reasons this was a bad thing. And instead, Kathy pipes up with, Katie, I am so excited for where this is going to go. I think this is the smartest thing we've ever done. And I was like, all right, so we've got desire. But we still were worried that Kathy may not have the ability. She's going to be the most excited person on the team, but can we get her there? And I'll be honest, my team, her leader at the time, did not think that was an option. She's like, I don't think she's got the strength. Well, I will tell you, a year later, Kathy not only got there, Kathy was our rock star. She ended up getting promoted out of the whole thing because she was such a rock star. And we're now talking, oh, it's probably been close to 10 or 12 years since that. And I'm still good friends with a lot of people at Progressive. And sure enough, Kathy's still there and she's still a rock star and she's doing fabulous things. So understanding in our case, not only the desire, but her ability to change. We didn't give up on Kathy because we didn't think she had the competencies, but quite honestly, we changed up her leader. And that was key because her current leader was like, I can't get to these skills with her. So in the structure, we put her with somebody new because sometimes that new voice also can help bring different change and different competencies out of someone. So assessing the ability to change might make you rethink how you're going to get somebody there in the first place. And then the last part of ADKAR is really all about maintenance. So in that original slide where you've got this emotional turmoil, remember, we've got to go up the hill. And when we're pushing this elephant up the hill, we like to think it's a direct route, but sometimes we get halfway up the hill and the elephant falls back down and we got to push him back up again. And so this reinforcement concept is this idea that as you're going through change, people are going to have bad days. They're going to be tired from something else, and suddenly this change is the thing that is annoying them. Or they hit a bump and it just feels harder than it should be. And they're like, yes, we've waited long enough and it's not working, and they're ready to give up. Those are the moments when we really need to reinforce and go back to, here's why we did this. This is the benefits, right? This can't change management is not what we told them, and why aren't we done? Which is where most organizations really trip up when it comes to implementing consistent changes. The minute people balk, they run away, or they get a little tired 3 months out and they're like, oh, yeah, nobody's happy with it. We're going backwards. Like, well, they've learned that over time I can go backwards, so I will. And that's when things start to fall apart. So in your assessing for change, one of the key ways to think about this is, first of all, thinking about how frustrated are people with the status quo. If people are really, really frustrated with status quo, then guess what? They're probably more likely to adopt change, and they're definitely more likely to maybe just try some different things out. On the flip side is, right, the other piece you need to think about is, what is the perceived need for dramatically different results? So if I'm really frustrated, but I don't like, I need it to be better, but it doesn't have, like, it's not that hard, then I might be able to make incremental modifications, right? I don't have to shove the elephant up the hill. I can take baby steps. On the flip side, if everybody's really frustrated and this is a big problem, you know what? We might have to pilot several different things. We might have to just go before we have the whole plan in place. And the reason this is important is because it impacts your change management plan. And sometimes we go with the, well, let's just do something, an experiment plan, when the reality is, yeah, people are frustrated, but it's not like the amount of change isn't dramatic. We could slow step this and see how it goes versus blow up the world and see what happens. And so this grid kind of gives you an idea how to plan it out. If there is very little frustration in an organization, but you need different results, this often will happen when it's, for example, a process that is behind the scenes. So nobody knows it's a problem but you, or maybe like somebody that's in charge of a particular area, but the general day-to-day people are like, it's fine, what's going on? Well, when you need those big kind of changes, then you have to start to create a burning platform. You have to create the noise that it takes for people to care enough about this in order to make changes. And this is one of the other areas that I often see organizations stumble when they're implementing something. Because, for example, if you're trying to implement a major system that nobody else cares about, but boy, your accounting team needs it because they're working on clunky old software that can't give them the reports that they need, but nobody else knows that. Well, if you just start changing it and you expect people to do something different and they don't have a reason to, they won't. They will get stuck in emotional turmoil and they won't ever get to full integration unless we spend time really planting those seeds and creating the burning platform even before we get to change. A couple of other things you can do to really make sure you're assessing the change for the organization. We always say at this stage, this is about listening to people. And it's not just about listening to people to solve their problem or to debate with them about whether or not you're right. It's listening to learn what's causing their emotional turmoil. What is their shock and denial based on? And what do they actually like? What would benefit them in the long run from their perspective? And so oftentimes early in this assessment phase, you may want to do focus groups or surveys or even just one-on-one conversations with key stakeholders so you can assess what are people going to have the hardest time with, or what is going to be their perspective on what skills they may need, or where they're going to feel most vulnerable in terms of their own abilities, so that you can be prepared with the change management plan, as opposed to just winging it, going down the road, and then finding out you needed some sort of support along the way. All of that, and you're only in the assess phase. This is the reason, like I said, so many organizations skip this part of the change management cycle. And it's where it's most dangerous to skip, because you can't prepare and plan if you don't first understand where you're starting from. So your ADKAR model becomes a really key part of every change. Now, the good news is the more you use it, the faster the entire assess process goes, but it needs to be a regular part of every change that you implement. It's why when you look at large organizations, they actually have people on staff that, like, all they do is facilitate change management processes. So the second piece, and feel free, if you have questions along the way, feel free to drop those into chat. Let me know. We're going to slide into preparing for the change and thinking about how you get to the next step. The first step in preparing for the change truly is thinking about what's the why. If you've never listened to the podcast or read the book by Simon Sinek around what's the why, this is a really critical concept. If you think back to that change management cycle of shock, denial, emotional turmoil, right? People don't go through that unless the why is big enough to make it worth it. So we have to get really clear on this piece of it. And one of the things that we struggle with when organizations are trying to implement change is sometimes they lose sight of the scope of what they were trying to do in the first place. And so these three questions are things that we really suggest become, once you've assessed the organization for change, now how do you start to prepare? And the first part is getting super clear on what problem are we trying to solve. One of my favorite exercises in this space is to actually have the key stakeholders related to a change come into a room, and I give them a stack of Post-it notes, and I tell them on each pull off as many Post-it notes as you need to write down the reasons, like what problem are we trying to solve with this particular change, right? What problem needs to be fixed? And I tell them put one problem per Post-it note so that we can look at all of them. And it's really interesting. We often say, well, here is the change we're going to implement. But then when I ask what problem we're trying to solve, it's one single change, but people think it's going to solve 10 or 15 different problems because they're not actually aligned on the problem they want to solve in the first place. And so doing this exercise early on to get alignment on what problem are we trying to solve, but just as importantly, what problems are out of scope? What are we not trying to solve? Because if we go in with misaligned expectations of what we're trying to solve or what we're not trying to solve, then the change is bound to fail no matter what. Because if you've convinced me that the benefit for moving this forward is that my time is spent on different things and I have to do less administrative work, right? And my life will be easier, but then you don't actually solve the thing that I needed to be easier, I'm going to think your change failed, even if it did everything you thought it was supposed to do. So getting this alignment on the front end around what problems are you trying to solve and what problems, while they might need to be solved, they're not going to be part of this particular change is a really important piece. And then the third question I love to ask organizations is, what will success look like if we are able to accomplish this? And in doing that, typically what I ask folks to do is imagine you are a year out. And sometimes if it's a bigger change, I'll say 3 years out, right? Imagine we're a year to 3 years out and everything about this change that we thought we would get from this went exactly as we had hoped. And we're really excited about where we were. What would we be telling people if we had to stand in front of a room full of people and tell people what we did and what we accomplished? What is it we would be telling them? And envisioning that future state helps us throughout the entire change management process in creating a burning platform, in raising desire, and in thinking about the what's in it for me, not from the organization's perspective, but for each person who has to go through the change. The second step in preparing for change is figuring out who the key stakeholders are. And I will tell you, this one seems really, really obvious, and we miss it most of the time. The person who is running the project says, I'm going to build the change management plan, and that's it. We don't think about who else might be involved, or we think about one or two people, but we really don't think about all of the stakeholders. And so who could all of your stakeholders be? Stakeholders could be decision makers. They can be the end user. And some projects, some changes will have all of these above, right? There are sometimes collaborators in the organization. If you have multiple departments that have to work on something, and maybe this department isn't directly impacted, but they're indirectly impacted, right? Accounting changes or HR changes often have lots of collaborators that need to be included. There might be consultants who need to be involved. There's likely technical or subject matter experts that maybe aren't part of the actual project, but need to be involved to make sure that we know that detail way out here in left field that's going to be impacted that we would otherwise miss. You need to know who your stark opponents are. Who's going to fight this tooth and nail? And the reason you want to know who those folks are, the earlier you get your stark opponent engaged, the better off you are in your long-term change management plan, right? Keep your enemies close, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. Sometimes can be a great tool. Also, the stark opponent who gets to start their own change management process of shock, denial, emotional turmoil before everyone else, by the time they get to actual rollout and implementation, they've gotten through that part of the process. I have a friend of mine, thankfully don't work with her, but she is a very dear friend. She does not do change well. And a couple of years ago, her organization was implementing a new software system. And she got asked to be on the committee, the pilot group to test the system before it went live. And she hates change. She hates change. And I'll never forget, we went to happy hour and she is so upset that she has to be on this pilot program. And her boss told her that built it up as this is a great way for you to develop a new skill and for you to be a leader in the organization. He really did pose it not as this is mandatory, but this is to benefit you. And it was. But she was so upset. It's about 6 months in, she's still just hopping mad that she has to be on this thing and that they're changing it and everything else. She's like, I don't even understand. Why don't you just let somebody else do all of this stuff and then I'll come along when it's all done? And I just sat there. I had to bite my tongue. I think I lost the whole left side of my tongue that day because sometimes your friends don't want to hear your great HR advice. And I just sat there and laughed and thought, I can tell you why she's on that team. She's on that team because they were hoping that by getting her involved early, she might be at early adoption phase along the way. And that brings us to this concept of first followers. You need to find your first followers in order to really make any change successful. Who are those people that if you can get them engaged, right? Kathy, in my earlier example, Kathy raising her hand and being like, I am all in, was game changing, quite honestly, to several of her peers that we thought would be they had all of the skills, but we knew they might not have the desire. And they were like, oh, well, if Kathy's excited, then I'm excited. And it really did change their perspectives on things as we go. So as you think about those key stakeholders, this is one of my favorite videos, and I'm gonna show it for you today. I'm always hesitant to put a video in a webinar, but it's a good one. This is actually a YouTube video. You can find it yourself by just Googling or going to YouTube and looking for first follower dancing guy. I'm gonna share it. I will give you a heads up. It is intentionally filmed in a way that it's like a shaky camera. So the camera does shake. If that bothers you, you can, turn away for a moment or two. I've had some folks give me some feedback on it. It's not that it's a poor quality video. It is intentional. But this whole idea is about what's the benefit of finding your first followers, not always just your leader, but your first follower when you're implementing change.
If you've learned a lot about leadership and making a movement, then let's watch a movement happen start to finish in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons. First, of course, a leader needs the guts to stand alone and look ridiculous. But what he's doing is so simple, it's almost instructional. This is key. You must be easy to follow. Now here comes the first follower with a crucial role. He publicly shows everyone else how to follow. Notice how the leader embraces him as an equal. So it's not about the leader anymore, it's about them, plural. Notice how he's calling to his friends to join in. See, it takes guts to be a first follower. You stand out and you brave ridicule yourself. Being a first follower is an underappreciated form of leadership. The first follower transforms a lone nut into a leader. If the leader is the flint, the first follower is the spark that really makes the fire. Now here's the second follower. This is a turning point. It's proof the first has done well. Now it's not a lone nut and it's not two nuts. 3 is a crowd and a crowd is news. A movement must be public. Make sure outsiders see more than just the leader. Everyone needs to see the followers because new followers emulate followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, then 3 more immediately. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point, and now we have a movement. As more people jump in, it's no longer risky. If they were on the fence before, there's no reason not to join in now. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, and they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. And over the next minute, you'll see the rest who prefer to stay part of the crowd, because eventually they'd be ridiculed for not joining. And ladies and gentlemen, that is how a movement is made. So let's recap what we've learned. If you are a version of the shirtless dancing guy, all alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals, making everything clearly about the movement, not you. Be public, be easy to follow. But the biggest lesson here, did you catch it? Leadership is overglorified. Yes, it started with the shirtless guy, and he'll get all the credit, but you saw what really happened. It was the first follower that transformed a lone nut into a leader. There's no movement without the first follower. See, we're told that we all need to be leaders, but that would be really ineffective. The best way to make a movement, if you really care, is to courageously follow and show others how to follow. When you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first person to stand up and join in.
Again, one of my favorite videos, because I really do think, right, sometimes as leaders, we make it so important that we be at the front. And to be honest, if you can find these stakeholders that, particularly your first followers, that can be the momentum, then you can kind of be behind the scenes, because sometimes the person whose idea it was doesn't get listened to the same as the person who maybe was the first follower. I love, though, the ending of that as well, is thinking about the change management, back to assessing your organization, figuring out who do you have in your team who typically are these first followers or have potential to be. And as you assess, how do you take a team from maybe a culture of 10 where we don't like change, and instead shifting it where change is more acceptable? How do you find and develop people who have this ability to be a first follower and give them the leadership skills to really be effective in doing it? Sometimes that succession plan, that development need is most critical to your organization's overall approach to implementing change. Once you have these stakeholders, right, you've got this list of who are my stakeholders. You're like, great, Katie, I know who they are, but what the heck do I do with it? Then you go through your stakeholders list and you start to build what we refer to as RACI charts. RACI charts define who is responsible, so who's supposed to do the work, who is accountable, meaning who's the final decision maker, who's consulted, meaning who do I have to get their opinion on before I can move forward, and then who gets informed along the way. And some organizations use RACI charts when we're talking about a key process, and that is super valuable. But if you are implementing a significant change, you also need to go through this as it relates to that particular change. So for example, if we're implementing a change in my team and I ask Nicole and Sarah on my team to take the lead in that particular change, they become the responsible for figuring out what the change is going to be and planning it out. But for some parts of that change, they might need to get my approval. As the owner, I might say, you know what, you guys go research it, but I want to be able to, like, I'm going to give you the final go ahead. On the flip side, though, there's some parts of change that I'm like, if you send me a 10-page process document that says, here's how we're going to do it step by step, I can guarantee you I'm going to read the bullet points version and like the high level stuff. I'm going to assume they're in the weeds on it. So I really want them to take ownership of that. So I want them to not only write the process, they're the final decision maker on whether or not they get it right. So there's going to be parts of certain change projects where the people that are responsible are also the final decision makers. And there will be other situations in that process where, you know what, when you get to this point, right, maybe I've asked Nicole and Sarah to find a new vendor for us for our recruiting system. And they're going to be the ones to do all the research on what the system is going to be. But at the end of the day, when we get to the point of decide how much money we're going to spend, I'm going to be the accountable, right? Like those are key pieces. In other cases, like I said, I might care about what's the final dollar figure, but I don't care between vendor A and vendor B. I want them to give me some thoughts and I'll tell them if I have an opinion, but I want them to move forward without me. In that case, I'm consulted versus being accountable. And so if you take the people in your stakeholder list and plug them into each of the different steps that are going to have to go through your project in order for it to get to implementation, and figure out for each one these tenets of RACI charts, you will find that your change management goes much more easily. And one of the key when you're talking about change management, this informed bucket becomes really important, because this is why sometimes we get all the way ready to implement something and we go, ooh, we probably should have told somebody about 3 months ago that we were even thinking about this. We've got a volunteer organization that we're doing a major restructuring of our board of directors in 2025, and they need to vote on it in January, but most of the members don't even know what the current structure is. But I guarantee you, if in January I show up and skip to the podium and say, so we're going to restructure your board of directors and here's the new structure, and they have no frame of reference and they don't know it's coming, they're going to be like, this feels like somebody's doing something a little weird. So instead, this Friday, that exact same group of members is going to be together at our biggest conference of the year. So I'll have almost, like, if you're a member, you probably attend this event. And so at lunch, I am talking about the fact that here is what the organization's been working on this year. And in 2025, we expect to be ready to roll out this new structure. We're not ready to give you details today, but we just want to let you know, here are some key reasons we're doing it. And there will be a lot more information and communication to come in the coming months. Please be sure to take time to watch those videos as they come out. We really want to make sure that if you have concerns or questions, you have time to do it. I've informed them early on enough that when I need them to engage in the details, they will, but I'm not getting them involved before I need to. So all of that prepare for the change helps us really start, again, build the plan because of this work we do before we even get to some of the major pieces. From there, it is time to start planning. And to be honest, another spot where a lot of organizations go, okay, let's go. And there's not a plan. When you put together a communication plan for change management, you actually need to put together timelines. What needs to be communicated, how early in the process, who's going to get that communication, what are the milestones in which you're going to do that, and are there contingencies that you need to tell somebody that, oh, by the way, we're shooting for this date, but if this other thing doesn't happen, then we have to wait to do it. But you want to put this on paper so that all of those stakeholders that need to be consulted on the timing are aware of it. particularly in organizations that are doing a lot of change, this becomes really important because it's not just about this one. I mean, no organization just says, we're going to change this one thing right now, right? Part of the reason change management is hard is because you're changing this and this and this and this, and everything comes to a head all at the exact same time. If we're mapping out those milestones and those timings, we can start to think about, first of all, hold on, we've got 5 things that everybody thinks we need to start communicating about within about a 2-week period. As opposed to each of those things being an individual email, maybe we should do a Friday news you can use email. And that way it's all in one place and people can really pay attention to it. I've got an organization right now that just went through a pretty big structure change that we built for them. And they have a lot of new leaders. They have new leadership levels that didn't exist before. And we're actually building out a communication cadence for them so that everybody knows, here's the kinds of things we're going to talk about in one-on-ones and in team meetings and in email format. Right now, everything is email and everything is just coming at people in a fire hose. We were able to talk about all of this change management and instead build some tools. So now, as opposed to all those emails all week long, one of the leaders is they're going to keep a list of all of the things that need to be communicated that aren't urgent, but are important. And they're going to go into a news you can use email on Fridays so people can actually read one email and really pay attention to it in different ways. They've come up with ways to post other things in quick hit, easy spots for people to use as references. We have other meetings that we've scheduled that we know, like, okay, you know what? All of these projects are going to come to a head at about this time. Let's get everything to a point that we can have one offsite meeting and give an update on all of the different pieces. Then you have to actually create the communication plan. What needs to be communicated? Who should receive it, and what's the best mode to do it? And again, if your project is really small and it doesn't have big consequence, right? All of this, either you still need to do it, but it goes faster. It's about getting practiced about always doing the right steps, but don't spend 8 hours doing something for a minor change, but don't skip it because you do need to understand the ones that go really, really wrong are those changes that you're like, oh, this is no big deal. We'll just run with it and roll it out. And inevitably, those are the ones we underestimate, especially if it was a positive change. We underestimate the impact and we miss a step. And so thinking about, right, what are people's interest in it and what influence will they have starts to help us understand what category of communication they need to be in. And then starts having us think about how involved do they need to be? When do they need to be in that informed bucket and when do they not? All of that takes us through the implement the change process. And when we're able to do these first steps well, the implement part, you look up and you're like, wow, that was easy. Maybe we didn't need to do all that work because the elephant got up the hill and we didn't have all of the pain and consternation that normally goes with it, right? We got people through shock and denial and we moved them all the way up the hill and we kept the momentum going. They might slide back a little bit and that's okay, but we kept it going and we saw success. And the great part, when you implement really good, consistent change management practices in an organization, you get to the point that the team starts to recognize when they're in this shock, denial, and emotional turmoil phase. And everybody's like, oh my God, it's awful, it's awful, it's awful. And you step back and you say, okay, well, let's assess, like, is it so awful that you think we got it wrong? Or is it just in that awful, like, messy phase? People go, oh, well, it's just in the messy phase. It's okay, we'll get there. But they start to get this muscle in their brains and in our activities to know, I know I have to go through it because you can't skip it. It's like any grief cycle. You can't skip it, but you can get better at it and recognize the difference between this is just part of the messy process versus, oh, you know what? This change is actually going to fail and we need to we need to pivot fast because you don't want to ignore those pivot moments because you really can start making some big key mistakes along the way. In sustaining change, the key is get people involved early and often. Make sure you follow up. The biggest mistake we make in change management, and there's a lot of mistakes we make, but one of the biggest ones that we make is we think because we told people once that everybody's got it figured out. You not only have to tell people more than once, you have to tell people through many, many forms, because some of us see things visually, some of us need to hear it, some of us need to write it out ourselves, right? We all have different places. Make sure people have support for the change. Sometimes when they're going through that messy middle emotional turmoil, they just need to vent. They don't actually need you to change course, and make sure you've got somebody set up for them to do that with. And then most importantly, be flexible and be patient. We've got to listen so that we do hear those moments where we're like, oh, wait, that might actually be a problem we need to solve, and not ignore those pieces. But we also have to be patient enough to go, you know what? I hear what you're saying, and you might turn out to be right. Can we give it 2 more weeks? Can we try it for this much longer? And then keep that line of communication going so that people have a place to turn. We're going to go ahead at this point and open it up for questions. Should anybody have things along the way? Before we do that, just a quick piece of information for folks. First and foremost, we do offer, for any of our folks that attend one of our webinars, we offer a free HR strategy session. You can use that for typically what we do in those is we sit down and we talk through all of the different parts of your current HR approach, particularly, right, the areas that you feel like you're having challenges with. And we come back with recommendations of things that you might want to focus on over the next 1 to 3 years to align your HR strategy with your business strategy. And many of those things are things you can implement yourself, but they're ways that we can support you as well. But sometimes just knowing where you need to go is half the battle, and we like to make sure that we've got that support for you. To take advantage of that free offer, just email us at hr@peoplesolutioncenter.com. Nicole, our new client onboarding specialist, our coordinator for all of this, and our expert in this area, will make sure she gets a hold of you and gets that on our calendar so that we can spend time getting to know all of you. The other piece to just know along the way, certainly, like, in terms of the things that we offer, one of the reasons I share this at the end today is our leadership development classes are kicking off for the fall and winter season. And we offer leadership development at all different levels. Teaching your leaders to be good coaches and good leaders is one of the most important things you can do in helping them lead your change management efforts. So think about who on your team would benefit from our leadership development workshop series over the winter and fall, to really understand all the tenets of how to be a great coach, how to be a great leader, and how to lead organizations through changes like this. So just some things to keep on your radar for the season as we go into the winter months when folks are looking for development opportunities. I am going to go ahead and pause the recording there. Actually,